Welcome to the Climate Report. This is Forward Radio, WFMP, Louisville, and I'm Hart Hagen, your host. The purpose of this show is to inform you and then equip you to make an impact. And when I say inform you, I'm talking about there's a lot of exciting, interesting stuff we can learn along the path to solving the climate crisis. So this is episode 6. The war machine. So we're going to be talking about the war machine, the Pentagon, the military, wars we've fought overseas. And I want to tell you that I'm a lifelong patriot. I support our troops and I support our veterans, but I do not believe in having an out-of-control military budget that spends money on a lot of things which not only we do not need to have a strong defense, and we do not need for that thing we call national security. But so this show is about climate change, which is the greatest problem human beings have been called upon to solve. But climate change is not an isolated issue. If we're going to solve this problem, we need to understand our political system. And I'm not talking about the textbook, Pollyanna, Yankee Doodle version of our political system. I'm talking about the political system such as it really is in our world. I'm also talking about how our political system really, actually, in fact, works. There's a big difference between the textbook version and what really goes on in our culture and in our politics. And that means we need to understand how our economic system really works, not the textbook version, but in fact, in reality, in actuality, how does our economic system really work? To do this, we need to understand capitalism. We need to be able to critique capitalism. We need to be able to understand the difference between the small-scale entrepreneur and the large-scale behemoths, the mega corporations that are absolutely running the show in the United States today. They're absolutely shaping our society into a shape that most of us don't want. But first, let's talk about some of the basics of climate change. Now, why do we need to talk about the basics of climate change? Because so many Americans do not understand the basics. And those of us who do know the basics need to deepen our understanding. And those of us who have a deep understanding of climate science need to sharpen our understanding so we might become skilled communicators on this issue. The reason is that we need to be able to communicate among ourselves as citizens. It is widely acknowledged that if we want to influence our government, we have to be organized. But I submit to you that the better part of being organized is being effective communicators. And then when we do organize, when we do get together, then we have something to say and we can influence people. So, the reason we need to do this, to become good communicators, is that we cannot rely on the media to do this for us. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC will not do this work for us. The New York Times, even though it's a fine newspaper, will not do this work for us. The people that run our media, for reasons we'll get into, they have abandoned their post. Nor can we rely on the government to take the lead. To the contrary, we need to lead our government. That means communicating. That means communication skills. That means building skills we haven't had before. And it's a wonderful time to be doing that because the internet is something like 25 years old now. It's time that we learn how to leverage the power of the internet to serve our purposes as citizens. Segment 1, the basic facts of climate change. In this segment, I ask your permission to repeat some of the basic facts you may have heard in previous episodes, because repetition is the key to learning. And the more we know about basic scientific facts about climate change, the more we can dispel the myth that climate change is a hoax or a conspiracy or a religion. Question: how much have temperatures changed so far? Now, so far, we have warmed the climate by 1 degree Celsius over pre-industrial levels. A degree Celsius is about 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit. So when you hear a degree Celsius, if you want to convert that to Fahrenheit in your head, just almost double it. Just almost double it. If it's 1 degree, almost double that. Double that is 2, but back it off a little bit, and you've got 1.8. So, and then you'll get the ballpark figure for that. Now, this 1 degree of Celsius represents an annual global average. We will have extreme heat waves, we will have extreme cold, and even because of a 1 degree Celsius warming. The global average temperature has warmed about 1 degree Celsius since records were first kept around the year 1880. That's about how long we've been keeping records. Now, why is 1 degree Celsius a significant amount? Here's why. Because 1 degree Celsius sounds small, but it adds a lot of energy to the atmosphere. Heat energy, wind energy, adds a lot of heat energy to the atmosphere and brings about stronger winds, heavier rains, and even more severe droughts, because heat waves tend to cause droughts. So more heat waves means more severe droughts. Here's another question. Why are small changes in global average temperatures such a big problem? Here's why. So global warming is like the Earth having a fever. Now, if you have a fever and that fever raises your body temperature by 3 degrees or 5 degrees Fahrenheit, then you've got a serious situation. 3 degrees is you got a temperature of 102. 5 degrees, you got a temperature of 104. This is serious. So that's degrees Fahrenheit, but a slight change in the average global temperature means the Earth has a fever, and we're looking at 4 to 6 degrees by the end of the century. So the Earth currently has a low-grade fever. This low-grade fever has already caused inestimable heartache, especially in the poorer countries of the world, but also in industrialized countries such as in Europe, where record heat waves have claimed the lives of tens of thousands of individuals in the last 20 years. Now, current projections are that the Earth is set to gain 7 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. It's a serious situation that needs to be addressed. Imagine if your body had a 7 to 11 degree Fahrenheit rise in temperature. That would be a serious situation, and it's equally serious when the Earth has evolved and adapted and has created human civilization such that we have a certain temperature, and if we go much above that, then there's going to be serious problems. If we stay on our present course, temperatures are expected to rise 4 to 6 degrees Celsius or 7 to 11 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of the century. These are conservative estimates in the true sense of the word conservative. These are conservative estimates, and it's important for us to start immediately and take drastic action. But when we do that, we will have fun and create a better society for everyone. How's that? It's a no-lose situation. Another question. What are the international goals in terms of limiting the amount of temperature change? So, you may have heard about the Paris Agreement. Here's what went on with the Paris Agreement. The international community has decided that 2 degrees Celsius will be the target for the maximum amount of allowable temperature change. In other words, we're going to try to keep the global average temperatures down to within 2 degrees Celsius. Now, certain island nations and those in the Horn of Africa want the goal to be 1.5 degrees Celsius because they say 2 degrees could make their countries and their cultures disappear due to sea level rise in the case of the island nations like the Maldives in the Pacific, or drought in the case of nations in the Horn of Africa. So, why do we talk about the basics of climate change on every show? The reason is because we need to be able to talk about these things. This show is about communication. We need to be able to talk about these things. The mainstream media is not, emphatically not, doing this job for us. The only way our friends, neighbors, coworkers, and classmates will know about the issues is when we, you and me, learn to talk about the issues and learn to spread the word. Segment 2. So here we go. What is the true impact of war? The Pentagon, our military actions around the world, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq. What is the true impact of war? Here's why we need to talk about this, because we can solve the climate crisis or we can wage endless war, but we cannot do both. We can solve the climate crisis or we can continue to escalate nuclear arms as we are doing now, but we cannot do both. We can solve the climate crisis or we can continue to fight wars of aggression all around the world, but we cannot do both. Notice I used the term wars of aggression there. It's a legal term and it is a crime, and as opposed to a war of self-defense. Yes, the United States of America has done almost nothing but disregard international law for 70 years since the end of World War II. Segment 3, unjust wars of aggression. So let's look at some of these wars of aggression. So here are examples. The Iraq War was an unjust and indefensible war of aggression. We had no justification for being there. If there was a need to remove Saddam Hussein, if we feel that that's our business, it could have been done in a much better way. But I would submit to you that we didn't even have the right to do that. But I would assert that Iraq was an unjust and indefensible war of aggression. It was not in self-defense. It did not have the approbation or the approval of the international community or the UN or anything else. It was an unjust and indefensible war of aggression. Vietnam was an unprovoked and unjustifiable war of aggression. In total, nearly 3 million people died in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. There are just so many myths and misunderstood facts about Vietnam, one of which, this may sound strange, but we were actually at war with South Vietnam. We were not at war with North Vietnam. I'll have to explain that on another show. Next item, Iran in 1953. We wonder why the Iranians might not trust us. It goes back a long way, but in 1953 we ousted the democratically elected prime minister by the name of Mossadegh, and we replaced it with a tyrant, the Shah of Iran. That was an unjustified act of aggression on our part, and that's a prevailing theme. Same thing, Guatemala, 1954, an unjustified war of aggression on our part. The common theme in Latin America and all around the world is the United States military has been waging war on socialism, and not Soviet socialism, but grassroots socialism ever since 1917. So the Soviet Union was the big bad enemy, and anything that was called socialism, we decided to wage war on them, and that has happened all across South America, all across the Caribbean and Central America, and not only in my lifetime, but going back to World War I and before. Unjustified wars of aggression. Chile, 1973, we ousted the popularly elected Salvador Allende and replaced him with a fascist dictator by the name of Augusto Pinochet. That was an unjustified act of aggression on our part, and the CIA was all over it. President Nixon was all over it. Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, was all over it. And that was an unjustifiable, illegal, and immoral act of aggression on our part. Let's come forward again to Afghanistan from 2003 to the present. Endless war in Afghanistan. The justification was to go get Osama bin Laden. Well, we got Osama bin Laden under circumstances that I would argue are illegal, and because he was executed without the benefit of a trial. And I'm not saying I have any sympathy for him. I'm saying that we either obey the rule of law or we don't. Our occupation of Afghanistan is illegal and immoral, and so was the exact nature in which we apprehended the criminal that we were supposed to be going after. So I could go on with these, but suffice it to say, going back to Latin America, nearly every country in Latin America has been the object of military involvement, including Haiti and Honduras. I would assert that the poorest countries in Latin America are the ones that have had the most military involvement and intervention on the part of the United States. Haiti is the poorest. It has had the most intervention on the part of the U.S. military going back to the slave days when the Haitians threw off their slave owners, their French slave owners, and also Honduras is a very poor country that has the misfortune of being, if you look at a map of Central America, you've got Guatemala, El Salvador, and the other country escapes my mind, but they're surrounded by, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Guatemala have been under intense attack by the United States, especially in the Reagan years, but also in the Carter years, also in the Clinton years, under intense attack from the United States military, and because they dared to be socialist in the sense of grassroots socialism. They wanted policies that benefited their people, and we didn't want them to have policies that benefited their people because the interests of their people were adverse to American business interests. Yet another reason why these are unjustified wars of aggression. For example, the United Fruit Company was all over Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, and going back really far, but especially in the Eisenhower administration. Eisenhower's secretary was John Foster Dulles. John Foster Dulles was a good friend of the higher-ups, of the owner of the United Fruit Company, and if the Guatemalans or the Salvadorans or the Nicaraguans were going to give us any trouble at all, the U.S. military would be there to do a regime change. It's entirely immoral, unethical, and illegal, does not pass any of the tests of human decency or of fairness or justice in the world. Segment 4, cost. Let's look at some of the costs of military hardware. So, why do we look at the costs of military hardware? Because we've got about $1.5 trillion a year defense budget. Now somebody might say, "Oh, Hart, the defense budget is only $600 billion," but Veterans Affairs is not included in that. The long-term cost of long-term care of veterans is not included in the military budget. We should do a better job of taking care of our veterans, but that's not included in the Pentagon budget, nor is anything we do with nuclear arms, which is under the Department of Energy. So nuclear is under the Department of Energy. And all these costs compete with all the other things we could do with the same money. So, fighter planes. This is F-35 fighter plane. 2,456 aircraft have been ordered at a cost of $406.5 billion. So, and some of these are sold to other countries. So when we sell, F-35s to Japan, then China is under pressure because China and Japan are a little bit adverse in their corner of the world, so it creates escalation between China and Japan. Is it worth it? Let's look at another item of military hardware, aircraft carriers. So the Ford aircraft carrier costs $13 billion. And arguably it's not needed. If we wanted to know if additional aircraft carriers were needed, we would want to do simple things like how many aircraft carriers do we already have? What are they being used for? Basically, in peacetime, if aircraft carriers are an aggressive instrument. So we need to look at that. And as people, as citizens, we need to know that these issues at root are not complicated. The people who want us to think they're complicated are the people who don't want us to be part of the decision-making process. That needs to change. Next item, cruise missiles. So, when we attacked Libya in recent years, something on the order of 150 cruise missiles were fired on Libya. Each one of them costs, I don't know how much they cost. I'll have to research that. But, every single cruise missile costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. And we just ordered 149 Tomahawk Block 4 cruise missiles for $202.3 billion on my transcript here. Next item, the cost to equip a soldier in Afghanistan. The estimates range from $500,000 to $2 million, depending on when you're counting, depending on what you decide to count. But a minimum of $500,000, probably $1 million, is a closer estimate to what it takes to equip and support one soldier in Afghanistan. So why do soldiers join? Many reasons. But one of the reasons soldiers join is to get a college education. Another reason is because they need a job. Another reason is because they want a college education. How many soldiers, how many people could we give college education on the cost that it takes to equip a soldier? And the thing is, college education pays for itself. We have long recognized that K through 12 education pays for itself. That's why we do it at public expense. And although we have been busy about the job of defunding public education in recent years, we still acknowledge at some level that K through 12 public education pays for itself. So we've been paying for K through 12 public education for over 100 years. How come we haven't, even in 100 years, with all that's changed in the world and all the reasons, and education is important, how come we have not added 4 years to the number of years of education we are willing to pay? From an economic standpoint, a lean budget is no reason to not have free college education. But we'll go into that we just have numerous examples and abundant evidence that says college education pays for itself. It should be free. Segment 5, the war on climate. So here are the reasons why the war machine is waging war on the climate. Number one, war competes for funding with everything else we care about. War competes for funding with everything else we care about. The war machine competes with clean energy infrastructure. Don't we need clean energy infrastructure such as high-speed trains, such as electric grids that accommodate renewable technologies such as solar energy? So not only does the war machine compete with clean energy projects, the war machine competes for scientific minds. We have all this government money going into the war machine. It could be going into other things which have the economic benefits that the war machine has, and then some. So we keep funding the war machine, but partly for the economic benefits and the spin-off technologies. But if we were to build high-speed trains and solar infrastructure and clean energy infrastructure, smart infrastructure for electricity, we would be employing the same scientific minds and have the same economic benefits, but we would have so many more benefits, not least of all preparing the world for a hospitable climate. Next item, the war machine competes for university research. Now, when corporations pay universities for research, it's called science, but it is so different. It is so different from science as we usually think of science. We usually think of science as being public-minded, and we think of science as being something that can be shared among scientists, and it can be peer-reviewed. But all of that changes when we fund when all of that changes when corporations pay universities for research. All of a sudden, science is no longer a public. Is no longer a public asset. It's no longer transparent. We no longer can have access to the science that goes on in universities, and sometimes it's secret. It's not always peer reviewed. In fact, so why don't we pour that into instead of corporations, instead of enabling and empowering corporations to pay for all of this science, why don't we enable and empower the government to do research that we really need? And when I say government, it is not a bad word. Imagine that in America, government not being a bad word. We have been fooled. We have been sold down the river. We have been led down the garden path when it comes to the benefits and value of government versus the private sector, especially when we're giving all this power and all this money to unaccountable private tyrannies. That's what a corporation is. It's an unaccountable private tyranny that has collectively they have a big impact on our life. We should have the right and the privilege of knowing what they do and redirecting their money. And we do that under the umbrella of government. We have a huge amount of government control as it is. We need to redirect that government control to things that help and things that make progress for our society. Next item. Well, the war machine competes with all other budget items. Any type of social spending, the war machine competes with that. When we there's always enough money for war, but when it comes to Social Security or Medicare or public assistance for needy families, we're always broke. Please know, if you don't learn anything else from this show, please know that there's a huge difference between the rhetoric and the reality of government, of politicians, and of corporate interests, including the corporate media. So this next item I have here So, segment 6, National Security Strategy. Now, the National Security Strategy is a document that is published every few years. Every president publishes at least one national security strategy. We need to be in the habit and the practice of reading some of these government documents so that we can take charge of our country. So, National Security Strategy is one such document. There is a new national security strategy under President Trump, but I'm choosing to use the one that was developed under President Obama to show you that this is what a supposedly liberal president is saying, as opposed to the newest occupant of the White House. So, National Security Strategy. It starts like this. Today, the United States is stronger and better positioned to seize the opportunities of a still new century and safeguard our interests against the risks of an insecure world. America's growing economic strength is the foundation of our national security and a critical source of our influence abroad. Now, I'm going to take those two sentences and about a half dozen other sentences and respond to them. So, first sentence from the National Security Strategy. Today, the United States is stronger and better positioned to seize the opportunities of a still new century and safeguard our interests against the risks of an insecure world. And my questions are, what opportunities are we seizing? That's one question. What opportunities are we seizing? Because we can look at the 20th century and all the way up to the present and show that opportunities are opportunities for multinational corporations based in America, and their interests are adverse to regular people. Next question I have, who will benefit when we seize these aforementioned opportunities? Number 3, it says, the risks of an insecure world. In exactly what ways are we in an insecure world? Don't we, by our military actions, make the world more insecure? The answer is emphatically yes. Segment 8, Economic Strength. So here's another quote from the National Security Strategy. America's growing economic strength is the foundation of our national security and a critical source of our influence abroad. So when you think national security, you think the government is protecting us from terrorists. But whenever they use the word national security, I want you to substitute that for national insecurity, because almost everything the military does in the name of national security actually it results in more national insecurity. So let me go on to the next quote. Jobs and unemployment. Since the Great Recession, this quoting from the National Security Strategy, since the Great Recession, we have created nearly 11 million new jobs during the longest private sector job growth in our history. Whenever the government talks about jobs, beware, because they're not telling you the real story. And in this sense, I'm using the term government in a negative sense, but yeah, they're still up to no good, even though theoretically they could be up to get some good. So, we could create more jobs, better paying jobs, and more interesting jobs if we would make the transition to a sustainable economy. So do we keep barreling down the road of having all the infrastructure we need to burn fossil fuels, including pipelines, including more drilling, including fracking? Fracking means hydraulic fracturing of natural gas, and the tar sands in Canada. Are we going to keep doing these huge mineral extraction and infrastructure projects? If we do that, those jobs, there are some good paying jobs, but it's about triple. If we want to really add to our economy, you can do a lot better job with renewable energy, because it involves a lot of creativity, and that's a robust economy, when you have jobs that require creativity as opposed to jobs where they've got it down to a system, they just need you to plug into their system. The oil company has their work down to a system, they just need you to plug into that system. Jobs like that tend to be insecure. Jobs like that tend to be not as numerous as we could have if we were pursuing renewable energy, and jobs like that tend to be less creative, less upward mobility. Another comment on this particular section. We could create more jobs, better paying jobs, and more interesting jobs if we were not beholden to so-called free trade agreements. We will have to talk about free trade agreements in future episodes, but suffice it to say at this point that free trade agreements are not freedom for you or for me. They are freedom for capital. They are freedom for big corporations, and quite often the effect is for them to destroy local economies. I could tell you stories about how free trade agreements have destroyed economies in Caribbean countries, in Mexico, in South America. And not least of all, free trade agreements are just bad for the working class, including the American working class. Okay, so let's look at the next statement from the National Security Strategy drafted by President Obama. Segment 9, World Leader in Oil and Gas Production. We are now the world leader in oil and gas production. Where do you start with this? We are the world leader in oil and gas production. We are the world leader in oil and gas production, and we're bragging about that. We need to keep it in the ground. We need to not be bragging about being a world leader in oil and gas production. We need to be bragging about being a world leader in renewable energy, and in many ways the government and the mega corporations are standing in the way of renewable energy and in clean transportation. Segment 10, Innovation? So we're continuing with the National Security Strategy, and the National Security Strategy says we continue to set the pace for science, technology, and innovation in the global economy. Whenever you hear science and whenever you hear technology, beware, because science is neutral and technology is neutral. Science was used to make the Nazi war machine great. Science is morally neutral. Technology is morally neutral. It depends on how it could be used. We could be using our dollars and our energy and our time and attention could be devoted to renewable and clean energy. Instead, it is devoted to the military. Another way we could be redirecting our money is into social programs. Social programs like Social Security are good for people, and they're good for our country, and they are good for our economy. When we invest in education, that's good for our economy. When we invest in healthcare, that's good for our economy. But healthcare is a different side. We could save so much money on healthcare if we were to go with a single payer system. We pay so much money on healthcare now because so much of what we pay goes to corporate profits. Big pharmaceutical companies are number one on the list of those that pay big money for lobbyists and for campaigns and for ads on TV. So when your insurance company pays for ads on TV, you're paying for those ads. That would not be the case if there were a single payer system. On the next episode, we will be going over similar language in the National Security Strategy where it talks to us about priorities. We will be going over this list. National Security Priority number 1, catastrophic attack on the U.S. homeland or critical infrastructure. Number 2, threats or attacks against the United States citizens abroad and our allies. Number 3, global economic crisis or widespread economic slowdown. Number 4, proliferation and or use of weapons of mass destruction. We will see, and it goes on up to number 8, we will see that in every case what we're doing now is exactly the wrong thing if we want to prevent terrorist attacks. We're doing exactly the wrong thing if we want to prevent threats or attacks against the U.S. Citizens abroad and our allies. All of these are nice sounding words, but we need to do the right thing in these regards instead of the wrong thing. So in the next episode, we will be talking more about war and the war machine and how it impacts our life and how it impacts the way So on the next episode, we will be talking more about how the war machine is actually making war on climate, on social well-being. And I say this with all due respect to our veterans and our troops. Many of our veterans and our troops are anti-war. In any event, we don't take good enough care of our veterans and our troops. I would say slash the Pentagon budget in half, but go over to Veterans Affairs and double the budget for our veterans. We need to take care of our veterans, and so we'll talk about that more. Thank you for joining me on the Climate Report. This has been episode 6 on WFMP Louisville. I'm Hart Hagen, your host. Join me for the next episode. Have a great day.